put America first. We put America last. The people that were in the Oval Office put America last, and we're not going to stand for it.
Back off, President Trump. What you're doing is ugly. Ugly for New York and ugly for the nation.
I'm remain hopeful that a deal can be made on many of these tariffs that will avoid any negative economic consequences long term.
These reckless tariffs will cost the American people thousands of dollars a year.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, more market volatility. The Dow and the S&P start the week down. The NASDAQ, however, saw a slight uptick. It's not so much the numbers today as the range of trading by 2,100 points on the Dow. But it's worth noting that Wall Street's losses matched a market sell-off globally. And the president has tried to balance things, and his administration officials have tried to ease the sense of anxiety. But here's the question. Are we beginning to see signs of political buyer's remorse? There might be some signs of that. Meanwhile, the president said he will add a 50% tariff on China in response to its announcement that it will raise tariffs on American imports. This question of buyer's remorse. Well, think about it this way. In a letter to shareholders this morning, the CEO of the nation's largest bank, Jamie Dimon, wrote, quote, "Whether or not the menu of tariffs causes a recession remains in question, but it will slow down growth." And billionaire investor and Trump backer Bill Ackman warned the new tariffs, if they fully take effect, would be the equivalent of launching a, quote, economic nuclear war. Over at the White House, the president welcomed Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, whose country is facing a 17% tariff, though it was clear as the two spoke, the negotiations are ongoing. Whether that happens or not, stay tuned. Both leaders were in the Oval Office, where the president said there are negotiations, but some of these tariffs may linger for quite some time.
We have many countries that are coming to negotiate deals with us, and they're going to be fair deals, and in certain cases, they're going to be paying substantial tariffs.
Also, the Supreme Court today weighed in on what the administration conceives as a wrongly deported man. Chief Justice John Roberts issued a temporary stay ahead of a midnight deadline to return that wrongly deported individual. What happens next for this Maryland man locked up at El Salvador's notorious mega prison? Well, we will find out. But I want to start tonight with Aaron Navarro at the White House, Kelly O'Grady in New York, and Nicole Killian on Capitol Hill. Aaron, I want to play some sound from the president, also from that Oval Office appearance, where he singled himself out on the tariff question. Let's listen.
Nobody but me would do this. You know, it would be nice to serve a nice, easy term, but we have an opportunity to change the fabric of our country. We have an opportunity to reset the table on trade.
Aaron, the president sees it as an opportunity. The market's not quite certain yet.
That's right, Major. And one interesting line I heard from President Trump during that Oval Office spray, he recalled the time of 1870 to 1913 in America and said that was the strongest time for the country. That was the time of the Second Industrial Revolution, as President Trump has talked a lot about bringing manufacturing back into the United States. Another notable point, President Trump said there would be no pause on the tariffs, despite some reports this morning, some readings of what his officials have been saying. At the same time, he did leave the door open to negotiations, though what I've been taking away from that is that some countries may be prioritized than others. For instance, this morning, President Trump said he had talked to the Prime Minister of Japan. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said he's working with the U.S. Trade Representative to open up negotiations with Japan and credited them for coming so soon to initiate those talks. But the European Union, who Trump has really laid out his gripes with, they offered a 0-for-0 tariff to take away their tariffs on U.S. cars and industrial goods. Asked if that was enough, Trump said flat out no, and he rejected that initial offer, despite that having some GOP support in Congress.
Some trading partners, it appears, are more equal than others. Aaron, hold on there at the White House. I want to talk to Kelly O'Grady. Kelly, I want to play for you sound from Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong. Listen.
It marks a seismic change in the global order. The era of rules-based globalization and free trade is over.
Kelly, that is very significant. Rules-based, globalization, free trade, over. That's the interpretation of America's trading partners, at least one of them.
Well, it seems that we are entering an era of protectionism, right? Instead of globalism when it comes to trade. And, you know, obviously there's many reasons. Aaron just mentioned a number of them of bringing manufacturing in here and having a domestic supply chain. But Major, I spoke with a number of businesses over the weekend and even one this morning, a fabric maker that said, look, that would be great, but the infrastructure just simply isn't there to do that. And so then when you look at what that's doing on a global scale with our trading partners, you see a lot of that anxiety reflected in the market today.
And Kelly, I want to ask you one other thing, because Peter Navarro has been very specific about this. He was on CNBC for almost 20 minutes this morning saying tariffs aren't it. There are all these other things, currency manipulation, intellectual property theft, VAT taxes or other kind of underlying taxes that basically go to the structural economic realities in our trading partner countries. And if those things aren't resolved, then it doesn't matter nearly so much what you do with your tariffs. So that seems to me to add layers of uncertainty to what actually needs to be negotiated to find a way out of this.
I was watching that same interview and I had the same reaction, Major. I said, oh gosh, I don't think investors are liking this. And really, if you look at what was happening in the market today, comments like that really just drum up anxiety for investors because they are focused on the short term, Major. Long term, be damned. An investor is looking at what a company on their earnings call is going to say about the impact of tariffs. And if it's my sales are down, consumers are spending less, and profits are down because of tariffs, investors don't want to be anywhere near that. So when you hear all of this rhetoric about tariffs being permanent, that all of those other things that Navarro was saying, that those need to be negotiated as well, it just drums up more uncertainty for investors that there is a possible negotiation or a meeting in the middle in the future.
Nicole Killian, I want to go to you on Capitol Hill because lots of lawmakers are in town. What did you hear today?
Well, look, I think what's notable is that we are hearing from more congressional Republicans about maybe the need to take a pause here and also to reclaim some of the authority that Congress has over trade policy. Last week, there was a bipartisan bill introduced by Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley, Washington State Senator Maria Cantwell, that basically would require congressional approval for tariffs and to disapprove tariffs, for that matter, would also require the president to notify Congress of any new tariffs. And so that bill has garnered some additional support from a number of other Republican senators. I believe about 7 now have backed that bill. There is a companion measure in the House that Nebraska Congressman Don Bacon is introducing. And then there are also some Democratic efforts, perhaps on the House side, through a discharge petition to also try to claw back some of that authority by negating the emergency powers that the president has to enact these types of tariffs. So certainly many members of Congress are getting an earful, although people like Speaker Mike Johnson are continuing to stand by the president for now, suggesting that, you know, people need to give him some breathing room and space for this tariff policy to take place. I did ask him, though, whether or not administration officials should brief members of Congress so they have a better understanding of what the end game is here. And he said that the Trump administration, the White House, is in touch with members. But that being said, there are some members who do want to hear more from this White House, and they will get a chance later this week when the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer appears here on Capitol Hill.
Kelly O'Grady, I want to go back to you in New York because when we were talking a moment ago, we showed a graphic of today's Dow Jones Industrial Average, and there was a little green blip. I'd like you to explain to our audience what that was today.
Well, the little green blip was a momentary hope, I think, from investors is how I would characterize it, because there was a report that turned out to be false, that there was a potential 90-day pause when it comes to these tariffs. And so you saw investors breathe a sigh of relief, and that was very much reflected in the Dow, as was, by the way, China's rhetoric over the weekend that, you know, we're not going to be negotiating. That's why you see that big red before that green spike, because there was, the Dow opened so low. And so I think that gets back to that point that I just made, Major, that really investors are focusing on the short term. And any comment, any hint, one way or another, is really reflected visually in how these indexes trade.
Lots of semantic shifting of social media posts. Aaron, back to you on the North Lawn of the White House. The administration made clear today, at least as clear as it could, no 90-day pause is currently being contemplated.
That's correct. At the same time, Trump talked about negotiations with other countries, but he made it clear that there would be no 90-day pause. One other thing from that Oval Office spray to mention, though, that's not related to the tariffs, is President Trump announced that this Saturday that top-level officials will be having direct talks with Iran, potentially about their nuclear capabilities. No intermediary countries involved. This is not only the first direct talks between U.S. and Iran, who Trump considers an adversary, in his second term, but comes after Iran's supreme leader has ruled out direct talks with the U.S., criticizing their, quote, maximum pressure policy that they have in place against the Middle Eastern country. Fast developing situation, though, and we'll see what happens this weekend.
Aaron, I'm really glad you mentioned that. And adjacent to those remarks, the president said if these talks don't go well, it could prove to be very dangerous for Iran, and that Iran cannot, under any circumstances, possess a nuclear weapon. I'm so glad you mentioned that. Aaron Navarro, the White House. Kelly O'Grady in New York. Nicole Killian on Capitol Hill. Thanks so much. Supreme Court steps in on the case of a Maryland man mistakenly deported to El Salvador. The decision that will keep him locked up, at least for a period of time, overseas, while lawyers here plead their various cases. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Chief Justice John Roberts today temporarily blocked a ruling from a federal district judge requiring the Trump administration to return a man to the United States that it had mistakenly deported to El Salvador. On Friday, a federal judge ordered the government to bring Kilmar Abrego Garcia back to the United States, setting a deadline of midnight tonight. Now, the White House has in court filings admitted a, quote, administrative error, unquote, resulted in him being sent to a Salvadoran prison. This despite a legal order prohibiting his removal. Interestingly, a Justice Department attorney who unsuccessfully argued this case last Friday has been placed on administrative leave. Sylvia Foster-Frau joins me now. She's a national investigative reporter for the Washington Post. Spends a lot of her time focused on immigration. It's great to have you here. Thanks so much for joining me. What is the status of this case? And this intervention by the Chief Justice is merely, as I understand it, to give the full court time to look at the briefs and all the underlying arguments.
Right. So it's just putting basically a complete pause on everything right now. There was that deadline that was supposed to be that this man, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, was supposed to be back in the United States by midnight tonight. So the Supreme Court's basically intervened, put a pause on it with the hopes of getting breathing room. They asked for his lawyers if they wanted to submit a brief to do so by tomorrow. And so it's really wait and see now for this man and his case.
The Fourth Circuit has ruled on this, though. That's one of the reasons it's gone up to the Supreme Court. It's gone through the process. What did the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals have to say?
The Fourth Circuit was very strong in the fact that basically this man, the government admitted that they had mistakenly sent this man to the El Salvador prison in 2019. He went through the court process that basically said that he had a legitimate fear of persecution from being returned to El Salvador, and put a withhold of removal. So basically saying he cannot be deported back to his home country because he has a legitimate fear. And so the fact that the government has now taken this man and put him back in El Salvador in a prison that is filled with gang members from the very gangs that he was fleeing is obviously, very problematic for the attorneys, but also the reason why I think the government itself has admitted we made a clerical error here in sending him to begin with.
And yet the government is arguing, if I understand it, it's a reversible error, an error that this government created but feels powerless, or is asserting a sort of powerlessness to correct that reversible error of its own making.
Yeah, so there's an interesting dynamic going on because, there was a big kind of social media splash when this agreement was first made, right? And the Trump administration was saying, we're paying $6 million and we're sending these immigrants to a Salvadoran prison, alleging that they're criminals and members of gangs, though, that has yet to be fully seen.
For all of them.
For
some
all
of them, yes, but for all of them, there's some questions about some.
Yes, right. And actually, CBS was just reporting yesterday that 75% of them, you guys could not find criminal records for them, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so there's this interesting question now. The Trump administration is basically saying they're in Bukele's hands now. They're in the Salvadoran president's hands, and we don't have control over him. But at the same time, they have agreed to pay money for the detention. They had Kirsty Noam, the Secretary of Homeland Security, go down to El Salvador and kind of tout it as like, this is our new immigration plan. Right. This is part of our immigration enforcement strategy. And so that's the kind of tension we're seeing play out now in court.
And do we have any sense at all of the timeline for the Supreme Court?
No sense.
That's very hard to know.
Yes, it could be, hopefully, thoughts maybe just a few days sometime this week, but hard to say.
And when we talk about the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, that was a 3-judge panel that reviewed this case, and it was a unanimous ruling against the Trump administration.
I believe so, yes.
So this is all about a kind of pivotal question about due process. If you have a reversible error, what is your obligation as a government to correct it? And the Supreme Court's going to try to sort all that out.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. Sylvia Foster-Frye, appreciate it. Please come back. Economist Justin Wolfers says that President Trump's tariffs will, in his words, radically change our lives. Why he's calling the move, quote, madness. You'll find out why next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. President Trump is threatening additional tariffs on China, 50% more. This as the market saw another turbulent day of trading. Here is how the president defended his tariff approach.
No other president would be willing to do what I'm doing or to even go through it. Now, I don't mind going through it because I see a beautiful picture at the end.
A beautiful picture at the end. For more on what that picture might in fact look like, I want to bring in Justin Wolfers. He is a professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan. It's great to have you with us. Justice, you wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. You know what it says, but my audience does it, so let me go through it a little bit. Quote, your life will never be the same after these tariffs. You wrote also, these tariffs are going to hurt a lot. By my calculations, this round of tariffs may be 50 times as painful as the ones Donald Trump instituted in his first term. Simple question, why?
Yeah, so this is not just bluster. This is actually what basic economics tells us. Look, there's two things that tariffs do. The higher tariffs are, the less we trade with others. That, of course, means that, the car you wanted to buy, you make do with something else. And then the higher tariffs get, the more you end up making do with worse and worse substitutes. The net result of that is a pretty basic economic idea, which is small tariffs aren't much of a problem, but big tariffs can cause enormous pain. And if you simply work through the math of this, it turns out that this set of tariffs will be 50 times more painful than the last set. And that's because this time it's much, much higher tariffs, and it applies to every country and every good. Every part of your life is about to change.
And Justin, when the president says, and his economic advisors speaking on his behalf also say, we simply want countries that trade with us to buy as much of our goods as we buy of theirs. Is that practical?
No. Look, it's about as practical as me saying that I wish that Trader Joe's would buy as much of my stuff as I buy of theirs. I go to the grocery store. I spend a lot of money there. I do so willingly because I can use what I get for that money, food, to feed and nourish my family. But Trader Joe's and I don't have balanced trade the same way China and the United States don't have balanced trade. I turn up to Trader Joe's, I offer to sell them economics lectures, but it turns out they don't want to buy what it is I'm selling. Now, it doesn't create any economic problems because the University of Michigan is willing to buy what I'm selling. So overall, Justin Wolfers Inc. is doing just fine. And the same logic goes for the United States. Overall, the US gets a pretty good deal out of international trade. We buy some stuff, we sell some stuff, and all of our lives are enriched because we get plugged into the enormous variety of wonderful products that people all around the world make for us and with us.
If Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, were here, Justin, he might say, okay, let's take your example. Justin Wolfers Inc. goes into Trader Joe's, but Trader Joe's, if it's China, uses hackers to steal information from your iPhone. That's intellectual property. It manipulates its currency, which makes your dollar go less far than it otherwise would. And it subsidizes its products in ways you can't for your incorporation. They say all of those things underlie an unfair trade relationship. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think when you tried to make his story make sense, it sounded utterly absurd. Look, there are serious trading issues. There are, for instance, big questions about intellectual property theft from China. If that's the question you want to solve, then what you need to do is think about tariffs and reaching out to the Chinese on the specific set of strategic goods. It doesn't tell you that you want to put tariffs on Australia, tariffs on Madagascar, tariffs on India, tariffs on the whole world. If what you have is strategic goals, you have strategic tariffs. What we have is across-the-board tariffs, which appear to have no real rationale at all.
And Justin, I want to ask you something that my colleague Aaron Navarro brought up when he was joining us from the North Lawn of the White House, quoting the president saying, America's wealth was never greater by percentage than the years 1870 to 1913. Evaluate that.
Stupid, moronic. Let's be serious about this. There was no outdoor plumbing, no indoor plumbing. You had to go outside to use the toilet. You didn't have antibiotics. You didn't have vaccines. You barely owned anything. Even just go back to your grandparents' era. Your grandparents probably grew up with 3 wooden toys. My kids grow up with enormously more. Look, if you want to go back to 1890, he's got exactly the right set of policies in place.
What is the short-term risk for the average investor in this country, the average consumer?
Both. Look, I've had all sorts of older Americans reach out to me over the past couple of days, terrified because their portfolio, their 401ks and their retirement plans are down 10% and they can't afford to lose that. By the same token, every one of us wakes up every day and we try and get our paycheck as far as we can. We want to feed our families and we want to be able to buy iPhones and we want to be able to clothe our families. And it turns out the reason we can afford to do those things is because the United States is really good at doing a bunch of things. For instance, we're really good at writing software, so we design the software behind the iPhone. Other countries are really good at other things, for instance, putting the iPhone together. And if we brought iPhone manufacturing onshore, it would be the same phone, but it would be $3,000, and no one's life would be any better off as a result.
Justin Wolfers, I appreciate your time and expertise, sir. Thank you.
A pleasure.
Some billionaires now balking at President Trump's tariffs. Why some of those who supported the president back in 2024 now say it just might be time to consider a U-turn. That's next here on America Decides. So, some influential business leaders who supported President Trump's return to the White House are expressing just a little bit of what might be called buyer's remorse. One goes by the name Bill Ackman. In a social media post, he warned that if the president does not place a 90-day pause on his proposed tariffs, then, quote, we will severely damage our reputation with the rest of the world that will take years and potentially decades to rehabilitate. I want to bring in our political reporter panel. Julia Manchester is a national political reporter for The Hill. Dave Weigel, political reporter for Semaphore. So, Julia, I'm old enough to remember 1982. Ronald Reagan's economic plan had been voted on and approved, but House Republicans were very, very nervous about its implications. And what the Reagan White House said was, stay the course.
Right.
To which many House Republicans muttered under their breath, you mean stay the curse. This is all true, folks. I'm old enough to remember it. You've just written recently about vulnerable Republicans on Capitol Hill and their maybe growing anxiety about tariffs.
There's a lot of anxiety, particularly for a lot of these House Republicans that won re-election or election in districts that Kamala Harris won in, the Don Bacons, the Mike Lawlers, for example. But we're also hearing that other vulnerable House Republicans, like Virginia Congresswoman Jen Kiggans, for example, are getting questions at town halls about these tariffs. And they're essentially Democrats are saying what we heard Bill Ackman say. They're saying that President Trump campaigned on lowering prices they are in the long term, they may not see lower prices because of these tariffs. So we're seeing that anxiety kind of start to rise among some Republicans on Capitol Hill, and Democrats, to use a cliche, are sort of ready to pounce.
Dave, I'm not sure if there's an answer to this question, but if you've lost Bill Ackman, you've lost blank.
Well, you might, in some cases, have lost Elon Musk. You might have lost a number of people who were part of the Trump coalition in 2024 because of the Trump 2019 economic record. Let's stop 2020. That's not his fault. They all agreed. But there was an expectation from a lot of the Ackmans of the world that Trump 2 was going to be like Trump 1. Maybe he wouldn't have Steve Mnuchin, but he would have the nearest equivalent off the shelf to let him bring back what he did in the first Trump term. And they weren't listening to what Trump was saying on the trail, which is that he was going to be unencumbered. He'd learned from his previous battles with the deep state, et cetera, and that could be whoever was impeding him. This Trump also has much more control over the Congressional Republican Party. There's 3 in those Trump seats, in those Harris seats, who are contradicting him. But listen to John Thune, listen to Mike Johnson. They do not have the willpower, I would say, of Mitch McConnell or Paul Ryan. They're not going to contravene him. So there is a lot more confidence in this Republican leadership in whatever Donald Trump says, even if there's short-term economic pain. And their lesson sometimes is 2019, the first Trump term. Sometimes it's Javier Milei. Sometimes it's Bukele. Sometimes it's foreign
From
leaders.
El Salvador, right?
Yeah,
and Javier Milei in Argentina,
who've just stuck to their guns even when the media told them not to, in very different economic situations in the United States. But that's their model. It's not just bending to the markets or bending to maybe Ronald Reagan's wisdom.
Julia, you mentioned this, Democrats willing to pounce. I want to play some sound from this weekend, and I want you to both evaluate, but you, Julia, first. Let's listen.
Their tariffs are not only imbecilic, they're illegal, they're unconstitutional, and we're going to turn this around.
Herbert Hoover gave us the crash of 1929. Donald Trump gave us the stock market crash of 2025.
We have gone from a Trump slump to a Trump train wreck. We are going into a red recession. Our 401ks are 201ks.
Well, they've got newer sound bites, that's for sure.
They do, and they are saying this is Trump's economy. They are trying to get him to own this, and they are banking on the fact that, or the hope that this is for the long term, not the short term. I mean, a lot of Republicans I talk to always caveat and say, well, we're a year and a half out from the midterms. So much can happen between now and then. But the fact of the matter is Americans are watching the stock market right now, and there is a lot of this bubbling anxiety. But one note of caution there, I would say, we were talking a lot about the stock market, for example, in November of 2024, October of 2024. That was an economic indicator that the Trump campaign actually warned a lot of us, not necessarily look at, and said focus on inflation, because we saw that the Biden campaign was touting the stock market.
Because it was generally stable enough.
Yes, exactly. But now we're seeing, Democrats try to highlight this, and they're banking on that inflation. Americans are going to be feeling this in their pocketbooks.
Oh, the age-old adage, where you stand depends on where you sit. Dave. Yes, we're a year and a half away, but there was evidence in Wisconsin and Illinois last week that you articulated that's interesting about mobilization and voter reaction to this moment.
Yeah, and that colors all of this, because if you're a Republican, you saw Donald Trump in 3 elections turn out voters who don't vote the rest of the time. And you saw in Wisconsin, even before Elon got there, groups like Turning Point Action saying, we're going to stay on the ground, recontact those 2024 voters, and we're going to try something new. Can we get MAGA voters out? The answer was they could get some. They got, in Wisconsin, about 230,000 more voters than had turned out for the Republican last time.
That's really good.
But then Democrats got 280,000 more voters.
Right.
And they really, and I quote Scott Walker and some other people in there, they were calculating, if we just get that number, there's no way Democrats are going to outvote us. And they did.
They won by 10 points in Wisconsin State Supreme Court race.
Even Democrats are not even, this is nice to talk to people before and after the election. They were not so going on the record saying we'll win by 10. They were hoping to win by 5. And that colors all this, too. If you're in, Republicans are still saying we are targeting not just every Democrat in a Trump seat, but even people in seats that Trump lost by 5 points. Right. And they're saying that, but that's not how members are looking at their districts. They're looking at Wisconsin saying, look, this, for example, there's 2 House seats in Wisconsin Republicans hold that this Democrat carried in the race for judge. The first district, which was Paul Ryan's old seat, the third, which was old Ron Kind. It's been very marginal, and they look at now. Are there people who went to Washington to do big things and lose? Sure. But a lot of them look at that and say, no one has cracked this. How do we turn out Trump 2024 voters out? And if they can't, then I might lose my seat.
And even granular races in Illinois caught your attention.
Yeah, even there were suburban races outside Chicago. Republicans were slaughtered. There were candidates who had very ambitious, had run for Congress, and they lost a race for mayor just because thousands more Democrats were turning out. Independents who vote Democratic. You heard it in the rhetoric from the speech. This still is a Democratic Party that wants to be the labor party, wants to be the manufacturing party. It's also the party of urban professionals with college degrees who have 401ks. And they're saying that. Their lingua franca is, hey, if you pay attention to news and you have investments and you went to college, one, you're very likely a voter. Two, you very likely voted for Kamala Harris last time. Three, you are paying attention every day. So we think you'll be easy to turn out in a midterm. And the Republican who turned out just for Trump, not so much.
Julia, I want you to bring this conversation home because there was this blip on the market. We talked about it earlier in the show. Oh, there might be a 90-day pause. That was not true. The market went back down. But what stuck in my ear, and I bet it stuck in yours, 90 days. What would 90 days mean? That's roughly the amount of time Republicans are asking themselves to use to pass the tax cuts.
Right.
What if we pause the tariffs for 90 days? How would that land?
Right, exactly. And look, there's so much. We're already seeing, particularly in the Senate, so much divide over tariffs. We're seeing Ted Cruz, for example, Rand Paul start to voice a lot of concern. You have a number of these Republicans who have signed on to that bipartisan bill with Maria Cantwell and Chuck Grassley. So there's clearly divide in the party. I think there is a wing of the party that certainly wants to push back on Trump. But again, to Dave's point.
And they know that these underlying negotiations over the size, scope, duration of the tax cuts will be difficult enough. You overlay tension and divides over tariffs?
Even more difficult, yes.
Julia Manchester, Dave Weigel, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it. President Trump goes after millions in federal funding for universities, the administration's efforts to eradicate what it calls diversity, equity, inclusion, efforts that the Supreme Court now says is legally permissible. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. The Supreme Court recently cleared the way for the Trump administration to cancel roughly $65 million in federal education grants linked to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The court's 5-4 ruling reversed the federal judge's order that had paused the termination of those grants. In a statement, Attorney General Pam Bondi called the High Court's decision, quote, a significant victory for President Trump and the rule of law. I want to bring in Todd Wolfson. He is the president of the American Association of University Professors. Todd, it's great to have you with us. How discouraged were you by the Supreme Court's ruling, and do you consider that the last word on this subject?
Thanks for having me, Major. Yes, I am discouraged. We are not happy about that ruling, but I do not think that's the final nail in the coffin here. I think that we will continue. We have another lawsuit out around the DEI executive order, and we expect that we will be able to push back and we will be able to stop what we think are unfair and unlawful cuts to DEI programs.
Todd, the administration says these efforts are about reversing what it characterizes as racist hiring policies. That's its reference to diversity, equity, inclusion, policing anti-Semitism on college campuses, and increasing public safety. Will you evaluate those three contentions? Yeah,
I'll take them one at a time. I mean, first off, I mean, there are all sorts of research programs that are being cut. Let me give you the most extreme example. There was somebody who's doing research on the diversity of genetic material in plants. And that research got a stop work order because it's a DEI program, right? There are researchers who are doing research on differing rates of infant mortality in urban and rural communities. And that gets a stop work order because it's DEI, because we want to understand the difference in infant mortality. The slash and burn approach to a broad, beautiful research infrastructure that we have in this country is being attacked. So that's one. That's like the DEI programs. Now, with respect to anti-Semitism, sure, there's anti-Semitism on campus, there's Islamophobia, there's racism on our campuses, and we have a program and way of dealing with that inside of Title VI and the Office on Civil Rights. And they are not following that process, which says that you have a hearing, and you find out what happened with a particular grant, and then potentially from there, if they have violated something, you can cut it. But let's look at what happened at Columbia University. They threatened to cut $400 million in research on biomedical research focused on cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes, things that we all need, the American public needs research on, that have nothing, zero to do with anti-Semitism on campus. And so they haven't offered a shred of evidence, and they're attacking projects that have nothing to do with the violation they're claiming. And I think the third point was police and protest. Certainly, we have to do a better job of figuring out how to both discipline students, but also allow for freedom of speech on our campuses. And I don't think that the attack on our research programs has anything to do with that. I think it's extortion is what the Trump administration did to Columbia and what they're trying to do to other universities.
Todd, you mentioned free speech. I wonder if you could describe, based on your knowledge yourself and those you interact with, your colleagues, what the atmosphere is like on campuses now and in classrooms regarding free speech and what professors feel they can or cannot or should not say or teach.
Yeah, it's a great question, Major. I'm getting emails, dozens of emails every day from faculty around this country. I teach at Rutgers University, and I've never seen such a palpable atmosphere of fear throughout our campuses, not just our foreign-born faculty and foreign-born students, but our U.S.-born faculty and students are also afraid. The campuses have gone quiet. People are afraid that they might have written something and published it a year ago in a journal, and now there's going to be some sort of retribution from the Trump administration. And so it's a palpable atmosphere of fear across higher education, which is such a detriment to every American. We need our students in classrooms learning. We need them doing critical thinking. We don't need them feeling like they're being watched by Big Brother, which is what's going on here. I mean, the Columbia demand from the Trump administration was that they wanted to have control over what was taught around Middle Eastern studies, around how we admit students. That means that Big Brother is in our classroom. Nobody voted for that, and nobody wants that.
Todd, for those in my audience who might say to themselves, not unreasonably, wait a minute, I've heard about tenure. Then professors don't have to worry about anything. Why should they be afraid?
First off, one faculty member just this year lost tenure at an institution for reposting something on Facebook. I think that this is precisely what the Trump administration is trying to do. They're trying to bully our institutions, and unfortunately, our institutions have not held tall enough to date. And they're trying to bully our institutions and tell them the rules. And so important institutions like tenure are being undermined, and academic freedom are being undermined by the Trump administration and their attempts to politically intrude on an autonomous institution. It really undermines the democratic principles of this country.
Todd Wolfson, thanks for your time and your perspective. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Major.
When we talk about America as a democracy, I think we should rephrase it, call it a pseudo-democracy.
Senator Bernie Sanders says the nation is moving rapidly toward what he calls an oligarchy influenced by billionaires. More on what he has to say about his fight against very big money in politics. That's next, right here on America Decides.
Americans around the country are out on the streets saying, no way, right? We're not going to give up without a fight.
If we don't stand up, we won't have a country tomorrow.
We are fighting literally for democracy.
Every issue from taking away people's Social Security.
The sound of agitated Americans who took to the streets this weekend for what was called hands-off demonstrations. In all, more than 1,200 events occurred across the country, organized principally, but not exclusively, by Democrats to speak out against a wide array of Trump administration policies. I want to bring in Robert Costa, who spoke with Senator Bernie Sanders for CBS News Sunday morning about some of this tumult, some of the issues driving it, and where the protest movement or moment finds itself. Robert, great to talk to you. We have some sound from that interview I want to get into in a moment, but Bernie Sanders is no stranger to populist roiling in American politics. Does he have any sense of how this moment is or isn't different from those in his more recent past?
Major, great to be with you. You recall when we covered 2017 and those early marches during the first Trump presidency. And there seemed to be at that time a galvanizing of the left, of many Democrats against President Trump. There's been a question in Washington and across the country in recent weeks. When would there be a resistance that made itself noticeable politically in this country? And the figure in recent weeks who has drawn more crowds, bigger crowds than anyone, is Senator Bernie Sanders, the progressive independent of Vermont. I also covered the protests over the weekend in Washington, Major. And if you couple together the weekend protests with what Senator Sanders and others have been doing on the road, you're starting to see an emerging opposition movement against the Trump presidency. It's been a little slower to action than we saw in 2017. But this time around, it's about getting working people back to the left, to not have that siren song to the right, as many Democrats worried happened in 2024.
And you talked to the senator about the state of American democracy, and I want to play that sound for our audience.
When we talk about America as a democracy, I think we should rephrase it, call it a pseudo-democracy. And it's not just Musk and the Republicans, it's billionaires in the Democratic Party as well.
That's a serious thing to say as a U.S. senator, pseudo-democracy, not a full democracy.
Look, you get one vote, and Elon Musk can spend $270 million to help elect Trump. Does that sound like a democracy to you?
Robert, that's heavy.
It is heavy, Major. I mean, to have a sitting U.S. senator call this country a pseudo-democracy, it makes you step back as a journalist and say, this is quite a crossroads we're at least in terms of how Senator Sanders sees the country. And this gets back to what I've been observing as a reporter and what we've all been covering at CBS is there is something that's growing out there against President Trump. But what makes it different this time is that when I talk to protesters over the weekend or talk to Senator Sanders, they're not talking so much about President Trump. It's about what they view as the power of wealth around President Trump. And that's a different characterization of what's happening in the country. There's really an anger towards, as Senator Sanders calls it, the billionaire class, Elon Musk at the fore of that, in his view, running the country essentially through Trump, where so much of the past Trump protest movements have been about Trump's character, what Trump is doing as president. This time around, it's a little bit broader in scope and theme.
Robert, you also had a fascinating conversation about the power of wealth in an entirely different context. Here in Washington, powerful law firms have resisted efforts by the Trump administration to do their bidding. Others have agreed and made deals with the Trump White House. And you talked to Senator Sanders about that. Let's listen.
What do you make of the law firms cutting deals?
Absolute cowardice.
Some of them seem pretty eager to cut a deal.
Because for them, you know, they're zillion-dollar law firms and money, money, money. So they're going to sell out their souls to Donald Trump in order to continue to be able to make money here in Washington.
What's the cost to the country when that sort of thing happens?
It is indescribable.
So, Robert, what is he getting at there?
Well, Major, you saw his jaw clench when he said money, money, money. He is going at the institutional collapse in this country as he sees it, whether it's law firms or other companies, really working with the Trump administration under pressure to succumb to what the Trump administration wants. Big, long story short, President Trump had this executive order asking these law firms to get in line or else they're going to lose business, lose the ability to work with the federal government. And these law firms are cutting deals. And the question is, how much pressure can the president exert across the board in all of these sectors? And what does that really mean for the country? Sanders says it has a cost to the moral and civic fabric of America.
And Robert, very quickly, he's an advocate. He has a very powerful voice in advocacy. Does he have one more candidacy in him?
Unlikely. I asked him about that, Major. He's 83 years old. A lot of his allies tell me privately if he was 73, they think he would be a front runner for the nomination in 2028. But he's not making the moves you need to run in 2028. But you never know. He didn't rule it out.
Would be a coveted endorsement if he doesn't run. No question about it. Robert Costa, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
That does it for today. I'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.